Hello, and salam suggestion to all. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelvin Cheng, analyst in the Economics, Trade, and Regional Integration Program at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS, Malaysia. My colleague Haris Zainul, also in the Economics program, will be co-moderating today and handling the Q&A session. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our partners today, the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur, for their collaboration and enduring support in convening this foreign policy speaker series. For the benefit of those joining for the first time, this webinar is part of the Foreign Policy Speaker Series, which began on 10th February 2021 and aims to cover broad themes like global foreign policy, the environment, economics and trade, women's empowerment, global public health assistance, human rights, South China Sea, and the implications of cyber policy on national security. Each webinar in this series will comprise speakers from Malaysia and the United States who will bring their expertise on specific topics discussing the policy implications for Malaysia, for the US, as well as for Malaysia-US relations. Today's webinar will be the sixth webinar, if I'm not mistaken, this year in this Foreign Policy Speaker Series. Before we launch into this, I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Andrew Johnson, Deputy Economic Counselor at the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur, to deliver his remarks. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Calvin, and good morning, everyone. Good evening to our participants from the United States, and hello to friends that are on the call. Let me just again extend the welcome of the U.S. Embassy to all of us joining today. We're really excited to be able to host this discussion as part of this ongoing series that we've developed, partly as a way to continue our engagement and outreach on these issues, even when wrestling with the everyday challenges of the MCO and the lockdown situation here in Malaysia. So really appreciate everyone's flexibility and participation as we reach out in all these new formats. I'd also, of course, like to thank our partners at ISIS Malaysia for helping to convene and organize these discussions, which I think we certainly get a lot out of, and I hope for the participants as well that we do too. Just a quick note on background. Again, I'm Andrew Johnson. I'm the Deputy Economic Counselor here at the U.S. Embassy. Just prior to this, I was actually the U.S. APEC coordinator for Malaysia's unusually challenging APEC host year as we tried to pull off a giant multilateral event as the pandemic unfolded. And so that I think I'll just lead in to note, of course, this is a really interesting and challenging time to be talking about trade policy in this part of the world in particular. I know from personal experience that the onset of the pandemic certainly gave us all a significant reality check into the challenges that underlie some of our trade policy discussions as we talk about supply chain issues. I spent a healthy chunk of March and April last year firsthand learning about exactly how interconnected US and Malaysia supply chains were as we discovered all of the companies here operating in Malaysia, for example, that were closely integrated into almost all of these US critical manufacturing sectors, whether it was medical devices, PPE, our E&E development, and sort of, learning through that process about how we needed to take actions to help build up these resilience, interconnectedness. I mean, I remember vividly, in our early discussions, I don't know if any of our MITI friends are on the call, where we were working with Malaysian suppliers that were producing, for example, components that were used in the manufacture of ventilators in the United States. And we worked out mechanisms to facilitate the resumption of those particular trade flows. But here on the ground, we hadn't necessarily, thought through the full ramifications of these second and third order suppliers, and had to go, and make desperate requests to get paper and ink manufacturers able to fully provide their imports and supplies into those manufacturers, so that things like critical labeling and packaging for all these components are able to come back online. And so, we're continuing this engagement now as we come through the pandemic, but also in these broader sort of discussions about restructuring trade and building out resilience. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from our two speakers today, as I'm sure the others are here, about this discussion about not just how we're looking at thinking about supply chain management as we move into this, sort of the post-pandemic and sort of next stages of the post-pandemic phase, but also as we engage this broader renewed discussion about these regional trade agreements and arrangements. Obviously, the United States is closely watching Malaysia's engagement on RCEP and CPTPP, but also all these other existing groupings. I was really pleased, as I think others were, to see the strong statement that came out this weekend from the APEC ministers responsible for trade that has kind of continued to renew the commitments of all of the APEC member economies to both use trade as a tool to combat and defeat the pandemic, but also to continue to build resilience across all the economies in this region, which I think is really a significant effort. And as I'm sure everyone here has been seeing, the United States government is continuing to renew its commitment across these domains and is also looking to deepen our efforts to draw on the growth of both multilateral trading sort of system, but also our bilateral trade relationships, also to further our goals to help develop human capital, to support our goals to tackle the climate crisis, and also to support sustainability in broader terms. So with that, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, looking forward to hearing good questions. And again, our huge thanks to our two speakers today and to our moderators in leading off this, I think, really timely discussion. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that, Mr. Johnson. Now, just to run through some basic housekeeping rules in the format of the event. Each speaker is invited to make initial remarks of up to 10 minutes, and then we'll have about 45 minutes of discussion and Q&A. Participants are invited to use the Q&A window in Zoom to ask questions, and please keep your questions and comments brief and succinct so that we can get as many people involved as possible. So our webinar today is titled Lessons from the Past, Strengthening the Trade and Reform Agenda for Sustainable Growth in the Region and Beyond. And we aim to talk about COVID-19, regional trade, economic growth, and how all these things affect US and Malaysia and the region as well. So we'll explore questions like, how can we strengthen trade activities in the region and beyond? What are the new and existing sources of trade growth that could be strengthened by both Malaysia and the US to build resilience in the coming years, especially with the new Biden administration? And could trade reforms and further regional cooperation through mega regional agreements like RCEP and CPTPP, could they provide sustainable growth in the medium to long terms for our economies? And to answer these questions, we have two excellent speakers today. Dr. Jayan Menon, visiting senior fellow at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. Dr. Menon is, of course, no stranger in the regional trade and economics circles, previously as lead economist in the ADB, as well as in the ADB Institute and Monash and Melbourne Universities. And Mr. Jim Loy is the partner and chief operating officer of the Asia Group, before which Mr. Loy spent 22 years in the US Department of State as a career foreign service officer and member of the Senior Foreign Service, and his work on trade policy and diplomacy in this region is well known. And I guess without further ado, over to you, Dr. Menon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Calvin, and good morning and good evening to everyone who's taken the trouble to tune in. So I have about 10 minutes, and I would like to start by trying to share my screen. I have a short PowerPoint presentation, and let me just see if I can get that up. Please let me know if you stop seeing or hearing me. Right. So what I hope to do in the next few minutes with you is to start off by speaking a little bit about the US-Malaysia economic relationship. I'll focus on the economic. I think Jim will say a bit more about the broader relationship later. And as Calvin and the Deputy Ambassador have already highlighted, there's a lot going on in this region in terms of its evolving architecture. The two things I'll focus on is the two things will be RCEP and CPTPP. I think most of those listening in will be familiar with them. Let's see what role they can play in re-engaging and bringing back growth as we try and get out of this horrible pandemic, and look at the impacts that it will have on Malaysia. And time permitting, I'll try and say a bit more about the future. Okay, so the first point, I guess, is that is to remind ourselves that the US-Malaysia relationship is a very long one and a very strong one, certainly in economic terms, but also in many other spheres as well. Bilateral trade is about 60 billion just before the pandemic hit in 2019, with the surplus in Malaysia's favor of about 25 billion. But of course, these numbers these days in a world of supply chains can be, quite misleading. For instance, if you look at the details, Malaysia's largest exports to the US is also its largest imports from the US, which is, all the electronics, electrical products, and so on. So the accounting now is not a good indicator of, how countries benefit or not from these sorts of trade flows with the supply chains. So I think, this surplus will probably grow further as the US-China trade war results in China exporting its surplus to other countries through relocation. But anyway, it's a strong trade relationship. It has a very long historical relationship with foreign direct investment, even during the British colonial period. The US was a significant investor in rubber plantations and tin processing. And cumulatively, the stock stands at about $11 billion today, around 6.5%, certainly not negligible. Of course, this share has fallen over time as the East Asian countries have increased their FDI in Malaysia and the region. So, you'd expect the share to keep falling, but it's still significant. Malaysia's investment is about $1 billion in the US. That is much smaller, right? So the relationship is strong, it's long, but at the moment, I guess both countries are somewhat preoccupied with domestic issues, both the pandemic and politics. And so this is standing in the way, I guess, to some extent of moving forward and building this relationship. But there's hope that America is now back with the end of the zero-sum game approach in the previous administration and with the new Biden administration. And Malaysia, hopefully, will be ready if it gets over its own political uncertainties as well as the pandemic. So both countries have pandemic and political preoccupations, but not for long, hopefully, right? And neither can really afford to continue this preoccupation, especially Malaysia, which is a small, open economy, heavily dependent on trade and investment, and very much linked to the global supply chains. So Malaysia is very involved in the regional architecture. It's a member of almost every agreement, ASEAN, RCEP, CPTPP, and APEC. As you can see, you can all recognize the Malaysian flag down there. It's right at the center of all the overlaps. So it has the opportunity to engage its trade and investment relationships because it's a member of all the modalities. The question is whether it in fact will take advantage of the opportunities that are provided. The US, of course, is only in APEC, in that regional sort of architecture, but it has other means of re-engaging. The new administration can come back in various other non-economic modalities. Security is an obvious one. We have the East Asia Summit or the ASEAN +8 forum, which includes all ASEAN and the +6 dialogue partners and Russia and the US. And of course, we're hearing a lot more these days about the Indo-Pacific, not just with the Quad meeting recently, but also more generally in relation to various economic issues as well, with the resilience of supply chains initiatives, and so on. And of course, we have climate change, the most pressing challenge of our generation and perhaps future generations. And this might be another way in which the US can re-engage with the region and bring that relationship, take that relationship forward. Right. Now, let me say a little bit about the two, big games in town, the CPTPP and RCEP, and how that affects Malaysia mainly, but also the US. So the CPTPP, as I think we all remember, was signed in March of 2018 and quickly entered into force by the end of that year, while the RCEP was signed at the end of last year and was welcomed during a period of gloom and doom with the pandemic raging, and celebrated as an all-Asian affair, creating the world's largest and in history, largest FTA. But they're very different agreements, despite the TPP being diluted after the US withdrew to become the CPTPP. So 22 provisions of the original TPP were suspended or revised. Most of them affected investment and intellectual property. Of course, the original TPP was almost an intellectual property agreement with other bits attached. A lot of that has gone. A lot of what Big Pharma had pushed for was taken out once the US withdrew. But it's still a very ambitious agreement. It deals with a lot of thorny WTO plus issues, like digital trade, the environment, and so on. RCEP, on the other hand, is a more traditional FTA with market access and support for the global supply chains at the crux of the agreement. But it's quite comprehensive. It has 20 chapters covering traditional and new issues, but the depth to which these chapters will end up covering is left to the negotiating parties and the process. So it's there on the table. It's up to the countries how far they want to go, and it covers almost everything. And so we should recognize that it will depend a lot on how it's implemented, and those impacts will of course take time. But I think the key issue to remind ourselves of with all of these agreements is that they work best when they're used to pursue national reforms. And that's the key challenge. But I think RCEP will allow everyone to gain. The gains won't be equal. I don't think China will dominate, as is the fear with many, which is largely why India withdrew. Because it's tied around supply chains, I think everyone will be lifted, but to different degrees. And it depends on the countries themselves, how much they use it, and so how much they can gain. But I think long-term, all of these agreements will be most useful if they remain open to new members joining, and they remain outward-looking. By that I mean, keeping the doors open, avoiding a traditional, Fortress Europe type outcome, multilateralizing their accords. So using it as a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. If it does all this, we may see a slow return of a more rules-based trading system, which has been under threat and still very weak, with the dispute settlement mechanism paralyzed after the previous US administration stopped reappointing judges to the appellate body. This might now change, hopefully, with the new US administration, and of course the new DG of the WTO, who's breathing a lot of life into this institution, and a lot of hope for the ministerial coming up in November this year. I think, as the Deputy Ambassador mentioned, these agreements and others have limited the temptation to raise protectionism during the pandemic and during the worst parts of the crisis, and it's aided recovery through trade in goods. But trade in services, especially people movement, as we know, has been still highly restricted in most countries. There's some signs of opening in the US and Europe, but in Asia, people movement still very limited. There's still a lot of concern with the new variants spreading in the region, but it's time to start preparing for the reopening, and these agreements can play a role in doing that. But I think the main issue, the main benefit to Malaysia, to the region, to the world, from these agreements, let alone the parties involved in the war, is if it can help in some way in resolving the US-China trade war. That's the big picture item, big ticket item, and that's the big picture we should focus on. How can we get over the US-China trade war? This is not helping anyone, really. And the more it moves towards a Cold War type situation over time, the worse everyone will be. We need to see how all of these initiatives and more can help us move towards some sort of resolution, or at least to stop it escalating. So far, there's no sign that that might happen, and so we need to work harder. It's hard. China has indicated that it wants to join CPTPP. I personally don't think that that can happen anytime soon. Will the US return is an open question. A lot of what it wanted from the agreement economically is no longer there and cannot come back in because it lost that opportunity by withdrawing. Some have spoken about a merger of the two big mega regionals. That's also not easy, but it's not impossible. And maybe a fresh start could be through APEC and its free trade agreement for the Asia Pacific, or FTAP. This is the only agreement at the moment, economic agreement, that has both the US and China in it already. So there's no baggage, there's no loss of faith in sort of trying to join an existing agreement or change existing agreements to suit your interests. So this might create an opportunity, but again, very early days. So I'm running out of time, so let me very quickly say a little bit about the likely impacts on Malaysia. As we know, Malaysia has not ratified the CPTPP and may not ever do so, and that's an open question. RCEP, I think, is arguably the more important agreement to Malaysia right now because of its ability to consolidate its position in the supply chain. And I think it's also more likely to be ratified by Malaysia. Will these agreements stop the so-called slide? Will it restore the waning domestic and foreign investment that Malaysia is facing? Will it deliver inclusive growth, which is what Malaysia desperately needs after the worst effects of the pandemic? And it's still ongoing. Malaysia is going through the worst wave right now and has the highest infection rate in the world per capita. And so there's a lot to ask from these agreements. We have to be realistic. Both agreements, even CPTPP, were to be ratified, will not resolve the most difficult issues on the trade-related agenda. I think GLC reform will not happen even if they ratify the CPTPP. Because of the CPTPP being ratified, it will require national initiatives, government procurement, and other difficult issues will not be, magically resolved simply by signing up to these agreements. They have to be a mechanism to help you do so through national reforms, right? They can help, but they cannot substitute for difficult national reforms. And that's where the challenge lies. So with that, let me stop there. I apologize for going a bit over time, but thank you for your attention. I look forward to the questions later on. Thank you. Back to you, Kelvin.
Thank you for that, Dr. Menon. I guess what you said about trade agreements work best when used by countries to pursue national reforms. I think that's an interesting point, and especially so in developing countries. And perhaps later in the Q&A and discussion, we can talk a bit more about that and a bit more about the future, including the road towards a FTAP in the region and the role of the US. Without further ado, Mr. Loy, please, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Menon, for your remarks. And thank you to the U.S. Embassy and ISIS for inviting me. So, I thought I would give a, just kind of a brief overview of the view from the U.S. I mean, we're only 5 months into the new administration. Many senior officials have yet to be confirmed, so there's still a lot in flux. But I think there are some overriding principles that we can observe. There are some priorities that I think give us a good sense of how the administration is going to proceed, not only in its approach to the Indo-Pacific, but how it will approach relationships with allies and partners, and then also in more focused areas on trade, investment, and economic partnership. So, first and foremost, we have a president who has been long steeped in foreign policy as a senator, as our vice president for 8 years, and now as president. So he gets it that foreign policy is important, that alliances and partners are important. He believes that the United States must lead, but that it must also not overextend itself. And we've already seen that in his decision to, withdraw from Afghanistan, and that the United States can't lead on its own, that it must rely on coalitions of the willing and with partners and allies. And thirdly, and very importantly, he believes that if the United States is to lead from a position of strength, it has to have its own house in order. And so we've seen that very early on in terms of his legislative priorities, the legislation that provided a boost to the economy to recover from COVID, what he's pursuing in terms of a large infrastructure package, et cetera. And then how does this manifest itself in the policy priority space? We see it, well, the way we describe it is the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and China. And under COVID is not only just kind of a response to the disease itself and the high priority on vaccinations and the reopening of the economy, but it's also kind of the longer term investments in the economy that need to take place that were kind of laid bare by COVID, whether that was shortages of PPE, of pharmaceuticals, a recognition that of over-reliance on foreign supply chains that were heavily concentrated in single points of failure, China being an example of that. Climate, very evident that the president takes climate change seriously. So we saw that in rejoining Paris, his selection of John Kerry to serve as his climate envoy. And you see climate intertwined not only into his foreign policy, but his domestic policy priorities, whether that's in terms of incentivizing renewable energy or how he's kind of focused on the trade aspects of climate. And then thirdly is China. The president does believe that, if you want to call it competition or the space that the U.S. And China will increasingly compete in, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, is a challenge that the United States needs to face head on, but again, not on its own, but in working with others who are like-minded, who have similar sets of values and shared concerns. And so you'll see that you've seen that so far in terms of how he has engaged, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The first two visitors to the White House being Prime Minister Suga and President Moon, to the U.S. allies, and then his first trip to Europe, where he's engaging NATO and European friends and allies. The second thing that I'd take a look at is that the fact that people really do matter in our system, and who the president has selected for his foreign policy and defense national security teams, I think is very important, and also should be seen as a positive indicator when it comes to our friends in the Indo-Pacific. His selection of Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, and Wendy Sherman as Deputy Secretary, for instance, all three very engaged in the Obama administration on our Asia-Pacific policy. Kurt Campbell, my former boss and also former business partner, is now the first ever Deputy National Security Advisor and Indo-Pacific Coordinator. The Asia Directorate, the Indo-Pacific Asia Directorate at the NSC is now by far the largest. Malaysia can look to the senior director for Asia minus China is Edgar Kagan, who was the deputy chief of mission at our embassy in Kuala Lumpur not too long ago. So he's somebody that understands certainly Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Dan Crittenbrink, who will be the assistant secretary at the State Department for East Asia Pacific, just left Vietnam as ambassador, but was also President Obama's senior most Asia Pacific advisor. So he understands the region extremely well, and in particular Southeast Asia. And I think you see similar sets of experiences at senior officials at the Pentagon. So this is all very important because in our system, the ideas that formulate policy and how they're executed, they need to come from people that have a grounding in the region, that understand it more than from just a topical perspective, but have actually lived, worked on the region for decades, and that is certainly the case now. It's still going to take some time for new officials to get confirmed and in place, and it's usually not until maybe the end of the summer or the fall when you see more concrete manifestations of policy, when the president should be traveling out for the East Asia Summit and APEC, COVID permitted. So I think, down from there, what you then see in terms of Indo-Pacific policy, you've already seen the heavy emphasis on alliances, on partners, and on multilateral engagement, which is certainly a contrast to the previous administration. One of the new points of emphasis being the Quad, and I think there's a lot of ambition in this administration for how to use the Quad for a whole host of policy areas. And I think you'll see renewed emphasis and commitment to ASEAN, East Asia Summit, and APEC. But I think much of that is still being formulated. Deputy Secretary Sherman was just in the region last week and made 2 stops in Southeast Asia and Cambodia and Indonesia. I think some other things that will be a bit of a contrast from the last administration. I mean, there is going to be a heavy emphasis on democratic values and human rights. Those are things that have long animated the president, and I think we'll continue to see that in his policies towards the region going forward. Now, when it comes to economic and trade policy, something that the president, in particular Jake Sullivan, you may have seen some of his writings about a belief that U.S. foreign and trade policy have diverged from kind of what's important to the large swath of the American public, the middle class. And what he believes is that if we're going to rebuild consensus and credibility around international economic and trade policy, the American people need to see that it is benefiting them. And right now, the perception is that it is not. And that leads to a whole host of problems that we saw in terms of the U.S. withdrawing from TPP, the fact that it's always very difficult to get trade promotion authority approved through the Congress. And unless you have that stronger foundation, just rolling out initiatives that are not going to get anywhere is not doing anybody any favors. Part of that is certainly, I think, the president's belief that the United States has allowed its industrial base to be hollowed out, that the United States is over reliant in critical sectors on unreliable sources. And you would have seen perhaps yesterday that a report was released, a 100-day report on the U.S. Supply chain security. There's a initial focus on semiconductors, high-capacity batteries, pharmaceuticals, rare earth metals, all of these being inputs to what the president sees are critical not only for the U.S. economy, but also for fighting climate change and what he sees as the future green economy. Part of that was also an announcement of a trade strike force. So the president believes that if we're going to rebuild credibility on trade policy and in trade agreements, that we have to be actively enforcing agreements that we already have in place, and we have to be using the full range of U.S. Trade tools, whether that's 232 or 301. So there's not going to be a whole lot of differentiation between this administration and the last in terms of using U.S. Trade tools to enforce agreements and ensure that American economic and trade interests are being supported. I think in terms of U.S.-China relationship, as much as I think the region hopes that there's going to be a market improvement, I think that's not going to be the case. I think it's going to continue to be quite tense. There is going to continue to be a focus not only from the administration but Congress on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, and I think when you pair that up with the vision that Xi Jinping has laid out for China, you're only going to see a continued clash of visions, of ideals, of values, and of interests. And that will, it is already animating a lot of what's happening in the United States, whether politically or legislatively. And that is going to continue. Now, I think before we turn to questions, I think the only thing that I would want to reinforce, additional thing I'd want to reinforce is a lot of times when we talk about trade and investment, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, we think about it from a governmental perspective. And that's because, frankly, in this region, governments play a much more engaged role in the economy, including through state enterprises, subsidized industries, et cetera. And the region tends to look at what the U.S. government is saying and doing, and kind of relating that to be the end all and be all of the United States when it comes to trade and investment. And I think what we have to remind ourselves is much of the U.S. engagement in this region is by the U.S. private sector. So the U.S. government does not go out and underwrite big projects like Belt and Road. The United States does not have state-owned enterprises that the government can direct to go build things below cost. What the U.S. government does is it tries to create an environment that is conducive to investors. And the U.S. is, and it still is, the largest investor in Southeast Asia, with stock of around $350 billion. And so that is something that I think the region constantly needs to look at, and not look at what new initiative or sum of money that the U.S. government is pledging. I think you're going to be impressed by certainly some of the things the Biden administration is doing. They just pledged an additional 500 million vaccinations, et cetera. They'll be announcing with the Europeans this month an initiative that will seek to provide an alternative to Belt and Road. So, I mean, there is an understanding that the U.S. can't just be out spewing rhetoric and talking points, that if it wants countries to choose alternates to Huawei and 5G, that there has to be another option. And I think there will be efforts to do so, but it's not just going to be the United States. It'll be in concert with partners and allies. So let me leave it there, because I think we want to make sure we spend plenty of time answering questions. And I'll turn it back to Calvin.
Thank you, Mr. Loy. I think those are some great points there. People need to see and feel that trade and foreign policy is benefiting them, and the gains from trade are spread more equally. And I guess that leads into U.S. industrial policy and the new U.S. industrial policy, and also that in turn leads to using U.S. tariff policies, the Section 301, 201 tariffs to affect that. So we're now heading into our Q&A section. And I'll now pass the floor, I think, to my colleague, Harry Zainal, to navigate this Q&A.
Thanks, Calvin. Thanks to all the speakers as well for the enlightening presentations. Good morning to all our participants, or good evening if you're on the other side of the world. My name is Haris, and I'll be moderating this question and answer session. As a gentle reminder, participants, you may post your questions through the Q&A window, and there's already 2 questions, so thank you for that. And for the other participants, you may also upvote the question that you'd like to see answered. Should you wish to intervene verbally, however, you may also choose to raise your hand, and we will call upon you. Also, housekeeping note about keeping your questions succinct, so we are able to take more questions in the next 30 minutes or so. To kick things off, let me just start with this. Dr. Menon, you mentioned a lot about the preoccupation of Malaysia and the US in pandemic management and domestic politics currently. But to shift the conversation perhaps slightly more towards Malaysia, and we'll have a question for the US following this, what's stopping Malaysia from ratifying either the CPTPP or RCEP, in your opinion? I know that, you know, in this kind of questions, it's not as clear cut as it seems, but, you know, I'm sure that it's more complicated than that. But perhaps if you could highlight a few of the more major challenges or obstacles that is in Malaysia's way. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. I guess, well, the immediate challenge stopping Malaysia from ratifying either agreement is that its parliament can't even sit, right? I mean, with the emergency. So that is, you know, a major barrier right now. But of course, I mean, when that's lifted, hopefully soon, I think, you know, the general problem with these, with the focus on these issues is this distrust of globalization that has seeped back in with this pandemic. So all those concerns about you know, of globalization and the way in which the benefits and costs are distributed have come back in a flurry with this pandemic. And some of them are quite legitimate concerns. We do know that you know, freeing up trade and investment is mutually beneficial, but not necessarily fair. Some people win, some people lose. So there is a need to try and deal with the unevenness of the costs and benefits, and that's a fair criticism and requiring a response from governments in addressing those inequities from liberalization. So that's something that I think needs to be overcome in moving forward with ratifying these agreements. As I said, I think Malaysia will ratify RCEP, you know, because it's not as scary as the CPTPP, you know, and there's so much flexibility and leeway in the way they implement it that there's not much, unlikely to be much resistance to it. CPTPP might get ratified, but I can't see that there's much momentum in that direction right now because of fears relating to you know, key issues to do with SOE reform and so on. Yeah, so let me stop there. Perhaps Jim also has something to say about that.
Tim, do
No,
you have any comments?
no, I think Dr. Menon covered it. He certainly knows the Malaysia domestic, political situation better than I do.
All right, cool. All right, let's move on. Mr. Loy, you had rattled off what I think is quite an impressive number of appointments done by the Biden administration so far. And while I think it's important to have the right people in place, I mean, people is just one half of the equation, right? With the other half, in my opinion at least, being prioritization. And I know the US being a big country and all that, I was just curious about how does Malaysia stand relative to other countries in the region in terms of its importance in engagement under this new administration?
Hmm. I mean, look, that'll be hard for me to answer with any, precision because, we don't have some of the people in office. I mean, I can tell you that, Malaysia is important in a multifaceted way. I mean, there's a lot of U.S. Investors and companies in Malaysia. I mean, certainly I worked with some of our clients, who were affected by the first MCO in the spring, and it was, I think, eye-opening to me just how important Malaysia was to lots of supply chains that were important to critical industries in the U.S. I know we also have a relatively close security and defense relationship. And just from a diplomatic perspective, Malaysia is certainly one of the major economies in Southeast Asia. And so look, I think there will always be Malaysia will always feature prominently when it comes to Southeast Asia policy. There are going to be, I think, some challenges ahead. I know there have been a couple of there are some ongoing cases related to labor rights that have led to restriction on exports of latex gloves and of palm oil. And from what I understand, some of those irritants may continue. And I also think this is an administration that has demonstrated that it's going to pay relatively close attention to labor rights. And we're seeing that in particular with Mexico, in part because, when I spoke to the issues of equity and fairness when it comes to trade policy, there is a sense, particularly amongst labor unions in the U.S., that U.S. workers are undercut by countries that don't treat their workers the way that American workers have to be treated, and that's a competitive disadvantage for American industry. So I deviated from there, but on the one hand, Malaysia will be important. On the other hand, I think we do have some issues that we're going to have to work through in the near term. So that's going to be a test.
All right, thank you, Salah. Let's shift the conversation a bit, further away from Malaysia specifically. We've received a question, and I also can imagine that's on the minds of many of our participants today about the US-China trade war and how that's developing, and how do you both perhaps, seeing how this could play out. Will it escalate, or is there optimism that things could perhaps make a turn for the better? Since Mr. Loy, you're already unmuted, so perhaps let's start with you and we can go to Dr. Manon after that.
Sure. Well, look, I started working on U.S.-China trade at the U.S. Trade Representative in 2002, so right when China was entering the WTO. And then I went to Beijing to our embassy, where I headed up our trade policy office. And I worked on every single major dialogue we've had with China on economics and trade, whether that was the JCCT, Hank Paulson's SED, or Tim Geithner and Hillary Clinton's SNED in the Obama administration. So I've spent a lot of years working on U.S.-China trade, and I am not optimistic at all. I think tremendous damage has already been done to the relationship. I think there is a low degree of credibility amongst our private sector with repeated Chinese promises of a level playing field and of reform and opening up. And so I think, even if there were kind of pledges to address longstanding U.S. Concerns, it's quite clear that, longer term Chinese economic policy is basically to create dependencies on China for some of the most, the most critical technologies and materials that the rest of the world needs. And I don't see that changing under Xi Jinping. And then you add on top of that the fact that we have a persistent source of bilateral irritants, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's issues like Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And so you have a ready-made stream of issues that are going to create pressure from the US Congress, from the US administration, and from others. And I think we all know how China reacts to what it perceives as either criticisms or interference in its core interests. Very difficult to see how either side back down, and Xi Jinping also, as he nears the next party Congress and a desire to have a third term, which would be certainly unprecedented since Deng Xiaoping, he is going to be increasingly focused on presenting a very strong and confident China that doesn't back down when confronted. So it's pretty much a recipe for more tension.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. Insightful answer. Over to you, Dr. Menon.
Well, I don't have much to add. I think Jim has covered all the issues, and I agree with what he has said. I tried to be desperately optimistic in my presentation and looking for, possibilities of trying to quell the tensions through, bringing them together in a trade or economic agreement. But the truth is, this is either unlikely or certainly unlikely anytime soon, unfortunately, as Jim has said. I think what we have to try and focus on is to stop the escalation more than anything else. I think, actually, if it stays mainly with tariffs, it's not such a bad thing. Tariffs are very clear-cut instruments. They can be measured. We can even pretty much work out how they will affect, economic outcomes. It's the escalation beyond tariffs that's the worry. Even in the economic sphere, let alone other spheres. When people start banning products or canceling visas, that kind of thing, that also bring on tit for tat reaction. That's when the economic costs can escalate, and that's what we have to avoid. So far, there were signs at one point of this phase 2 deal coming into play with the trade war. That's been on hold, and there's no signs that will be revived. But so it's not looking good. But let's try and focus on preventing an escalation. I think that's all we can hope for right now.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Menon. We have a question here about prospects for Malaysia and other middle-income countries to gain access to US transfer of technology in respect to vaccine manufacturing locally in Malaysia. Since the question is a bit niche, I'm not sure whether any of our speakers have looked into it. May I just check, Mr. Lloyd, do you have any thoughts on tech transfer of vaccine manufacturing?
To Malaysia itself, I'm not aware of. To Southeast Asian markets, I know there are discussions underway.
Right.
So it's
Did you want to share some thoughts on that?
Well, look, this is largely going to be a private, driven by. You put aside the waiver of IP provisions that the president has supported and is now at the WTO. But I think in terms of individual drug manufacturers, it's largely a private sector decision on whether they want to partner up with a government and transfer technology and other know-how. And as I said, I'm aware of some of those discussions underway, not with Malaysia, but with other markets in Southeast Asia. And of course, Singapore has also been fairly aggressive in building its own kind of pharmaceutical manufacturing sector by attracting, major drug manufacturers.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Menon, any thoughts?
I don't have much to say except for the fact that I guess the Biden administration's decision to ease up on the patents is a good thing, but it's not panacea either. I mean, the manufacturing of these vaccines are highly complex, and quality controls need to be in place. But if those logistics and technology constraints can be overcome, I think the long-term solution to this vaccine inequity lies in manufacturing locally. Right? If these countries can manufacture vaccines locally, then that's where we will make great inroads into coverage of the vaccinated, and that's the hope. It'll be helpful if countries that have these huge quotas that they don't need can release them quickly. Some countries have enough to vaccinate 300% of their population, which is ridiculous. So that will help, but the manufacturing capacity within country is where the real progress can be made, but that will take time.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Menon. I completely agree that it's not just about the patents or about intellectual property. It's a lot to do about the capacity to actually manufacture these vaccines. And these things are quite high tech, right? It's not any factory that can be retrofitted to create these advanced vaccines. Okay, we have a question here from Ken Nelson, who starts off saying that Malaysia lacks technical expertise, so an important competitive advantage comes from cheap labor, right? So that's what he says. But the question is more about how can the US help Malaysia to overcome this hurdle of a lack of technical expertise and a production model reliant on low-cost foreign labor and move towards greater economic complexity. So I think Dr. Menon, perhaps you can share a bit more about how can Malaysia overcome the lack of technical expertise bit and also are reliant on low-cost foreign labor, and perhaps Mr. Loy can take up the question about US willingness or at least political will for to share the kind of experiences needed.
Right. This is, of course, not an easy question to answer. This is also a question that's plaguing a lot of middle-income countries. I mean, how to transition towards higher value-added production and more technically sophisticated activities and so on. Malaysia, is often now described as a classic example of this middle-income trapped country, having lost their competitiveness in the activities that brought them to this point. They can't then move on to the next level. I'm glad the questioner didn't blame foreign labor for this. I mean, I think that's refreshing. We see that often, that people say the reason we don't move up is because all these foreign workers are there keeping us down. I don't think that's at all fair or true. It's a consequence rather than a cause of underlying problems. And the underlying problem, of course, is the lack of appropriately skilled labor force, right? I mean, you find that the largest number of unemployed in Malaysia are new graduates among the pool of unemployed, right? So that tells you that whatever, and you also at the same time have employers complaining about not being able to get suitably qualified staff. And so that tells you that, that's the definition of a skills mismatch, basically. So there's, fundamental problems rooted in the education system, in access to the education system with the preferential quotas and so on, and how these things actually can be cumulative over time, right? A failed education system produces failed teachers for the next generation. And so, you have this ratcheting effect in a race to the bottom, which you need to arrest somehow. I don't know, I don't have the answers, but I think there are lots of domestic reforms that are clearly required. And Malaysia has been trying to, increase the push towards the TVET sector, the technical and vocational training, which is a good sign, I think. But perhaps more along those lines is required in dealing with those skills mismatch problems. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Mr. Loy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess three things. One is I think this administration is rolling out the welcome mat again to foreign students. So I mean, the first thing would be encouraging Malaysian students to consider the U.S. when they think about their studies. The second thing would be having worked overseas, there are any number of U.S. institutions of higher learning that are looking to have satellite campuses in Asia and in Southeast Asia in particular. And so, I'm sure if Malaysia were interested in hosting some of those and facilitating their establishment, that's something that could happen. And then thirdly, I'd say, look, I think one of the benefits of having U.S. companies invest in any market is the fact that U.S. companies tend to employ more locals than I think other whether they're Japanese, Korean, or Chinese. And by employing more locals and by localizing many, positions from senior executive down, in the process, they train local talent. And I think, there's something to be said for that. It's not necessarily academics training, it's on-the-job training. So whether that's in manufacturing, high tech, digital economy, I think if you want to rapidly train up, kind of a core group of skill sets that will then attract other investment, you have to attract those companies to your market in the first place.
Thank you, Mr. Loy. All right, let's move on. Dr. Menon, I have a question for you. Are non-trade policy reforms such as those on governance more important than trade policy reforms?
Right. So Malaysia actually has quite a good record on trade policy. It's relatively open. It has very low effective tariffs on its trade. But I think, a lot of the issues are more domestic related that impinge upon trade and investment outcomes. One of them is, of course, governance, but governance is a very broad theme, but it manifests in various different ways. One area that I've worked on in the past is GLC reforms. We know that GLCs are dominant in almost every sector in Malaysia, and there is evidence of their dominance crowding out private investment. And so this is clearly, detrimental towards, improving competitiveness of the Malaysian economy and dealing with a lot of the issues we spoke about earlier in the previous question as well, right? So certainly that general governance issue is as or more important than technical trade policy issues because they manifest in a lot of trade and investment outcomes. And we need to increase investment domestically and revive foreign investment, which has dropped off very sharply, much more than you'd expect just from the pandemic alone, right? It's been trending downwards for a long time. There's also, Malaysia is an importer of labor, but an exporter of skills, right? Which is again another structural problem that might link in with the general governance issue. And of course, everyone speaks about the affirmative action program as being one that needs to be addressed. But I think what's worse, I mean, there's nothing wrong with affirmative action. I'm a great supporter of affirmative action. It's when it gets hijacked to serve the interests of the elites, right? Irrespective of race. That is the problem. That's what's happened in Malaysia, right? It's the cronies that have benefited the most from the preferential system at the expense of everyone, Malays and other races. They've all actually been made worse off as a result of the hijacking of system of preferences that was designed to actually increase inclusion. Right. So I've deviated a bit from the original, but since the question is about governance, I guess all of these issues matter, and they matter more than just the trade policy issues, which actually Malaysia has a good record on.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Mr. Jim, you talked about the new US industrial policy and how the new administration will be willing to use tariffs to achieve at least some of these goals. Will you elaborate on that and talk a bit more perhaps about how that will affect Malaysia and the region?
Well, I mean, I guess yes, it is an industrial policy in the sense that the U.S. government or this administration is going to be placing emphasis on what it considers to be kind of core technologies that will be either integral to U.S. national security or to economic security. And there is a degree of transparency in terms of, if you look at the report that the White House issued yesterday about the sectors that are going to be the focus of that, and there are going to be other additional sectors that will be announced in subsequent reports. I think where I think our approach will differ from other markets is it should not intended to be picking winners. It should be geared towards creating incentives that either bring manufacturing or technological know-how or R&D to the United States. But it is not going to be a case where we have government-linked corporations that are going to be favored in the development or the manufacturing of these core components. And I think that is a very important distinction in terms of how the United States will approach this. Support for R&D generally goes to kind of basic underlying R&D that then supports more advanced research and development, as opposed to picking a winning technology. And I think that is also a differentiating factor. Now, in terms of what does that mean for Malaysia, I think it's hard to tell. Look, I mean, it's no secret that this administration is going to want to increase, for instance, the manufacture of chips. I presume with things like solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, pharmaceuticals. So that will necessarily, if it's successful, decrease the demand, the amount of U.S. demand that is filled by overseas suppliers. But on the other hand, there is also a priority in de-risking U.S. supply chains from China. And so we are already seeing an accelerating shift of those supply chains out of southern China into other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. I think to date, Vietnam has probably benefited the most. There's no reason why Malaysia can't benefit from that shift as well, having already demonstrated its ability to host corporations that are at the cutting edge of technology. So I think there are certainly, yes, some competitive risks for Malaysia, but I think there are also some opportunities because look, the Biden administration is under no illusions that everything that the United States needs can or must be produced in the United States. So that is not the goal, right? The goal is to ensure that there is not a degree of reliance that undermines U.S. national and economic security. And if there's a preference to having these products and elements produced elsewhere, the desire is going to be for them to be produced somewhere other than China. And so, to that extent, I think Malaysia has tremendous benefits, not least because of its geostrategic location on a major trade route, and the fact that it, like I said, it already has a track record of having created an environment that was conducive to that type of investment.
Thank you, Mr. Loy. We have about enough time for one last question before we move to some concluding remarks, right? There's a question by Gerard, and I'm just going to read this because I don't quite understand it because I don't have a background in trade law, but he says that, Mr. Law, you mentioned in passing US trade law, I think it's section 301. Please advise if section 301 is consistent with WTO because some economies have argued the extraterritoriality of US trade law is not helpful to emerging developing economies. And I'm asking this with hopes that it makes more sense to you than me because I have no idea what this is referring to. Also, Dr. Menon, if you have any thoughts on that, perhaps you want to jump in after Mr. Loy.
Yeah, well, I'm not a trade lawyer. I've never aspired to be a trade lawyer. And yes, I understand that foreign governments don't appreciate U.S. trade law and believe that it undermines the WTO. Though I will say that there is a growing consensus in the U.S. that the WTO has kind of strayed from where it was supposed to have been, particularly with the dispute resolution process, and that the WTO, as it's currently structured, is basically not up to the task of dealing with the major threats to a kind of a fair and balanced playing field, and that it doesn't address, for instance, the new economy, the digital economy. It certainly does not address state-sponsored a state-sponsored economy of the magnitude of China's, and so I can't speak for the administration, but first and foremost, this is an administration that is going to defend U.S. interests and is certainly not going to put at risk any critical sectors of the U.S. economy, because of the WTO. So. Where that ends up ultimately, I have no idea. But as I am pessimistic about US-China, I think it's also very difficult to reform the WTO just because of the degree of consensus that's required. And I think, what we're likely to see are things outside of the WTO that start with small groups and then expand, and maybe they get to a point where it's large enough that you're able to then graft it onto the WTO, just in the way that the P4, became the TPP. That's just my own sense. I think it's going to be very difficult to get the WTO to a place where, frankly, everybody would be happy.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Menon. If you don't mind just sharing, would reforming WTO solve this kind of trade disputes, in your opinion, and what's the likelihood of that?
Right. So I think I'll take up from where Jim left off. I think the last point he made is the critical one, which is, the difficulties of getting a institution to reform itself, right? When the rules require, its membership to form some sort of consensus. This is not confined to the WTO, but it exemplifies the problem almost perfectly. One of one of the great benefits of the WTO, and also its greatest fault, is how, any one member can derail the process to some extent. And we saw this almost happen with the trade facilitation agreement when India had concerns, but that worked out, thankfully. And we might see it happen again with the digital agreement that's coming up in November, with, again, India and also South Africa perhaps, killing it off. I mean, hopefully not, but this is the difficulty. So if you, I think what we are seeing is how, as Jim said, small groups getting together, forming, shared views and positions, and then expanding them. This is second best, but we live in a second best world, I guess. And then trying to get to a point where there's enough sort of agreement, and then you test it out in a multilateral forum at the WTO. So the WTO is in need of reform. It's very difficult for the reform to take place given its governing rules, but it risks being sort of marginalized further. So maybe you'll see that and try and shake itself up in some way and increase its effectiveness. It's still critically important, I think. We need a forum like the WTO. Its dispute settlement mechanism needs improvement, but it's a fabulous fallback because the alternative is so much worse. So, hopefully, the collective interests will prevail, and they will see the benefit of reforming an institution that is going to die either by being marginalized and becoming irrelevant, if it doesn't actually change itself. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Menon. I think that with that, I think that's all the time we have for the question and answer session. I think I'll pass the floor back to Kelvin. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Harris. Great. I think we had a great conversation in sharing session today, and we're reaching past the allotted time now. I think a testament to the breadth of the conversation, no doubt. And let me just say I learned a lot, and I felt it was a very productive conversation. I guess the road ahead for international trade in the region is full of hurdles, and I think likely to get even more challenging as we move into the pandemic recovery stage within the next year. So I'd just like to say thank you to the US Embassy and thank you to our excellent speakers, Dr. Menon and Mr. Law, on behalf of ISIS Malaysia, on behalf of the participants, for taking time out of your day or evening to join us today and to share your insights with us. And thank you to our audience for attending and staying with us. Harris, if anything to say to close?
No, just big thanks to, of course, our the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur, also to the speakers for entertaining all the questions that I had and that the participants had. All right, just don't want to drag this on too long. All right, that's it for me. Thanks, everyone.
Sure thing. So yeah, I guess that's a close. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you all.
Right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.